This is the MyHeart.net podcast. This show is produced by Dr. Philip Johnson in conjunction with VitalEngine.com. Please welcome your host, Dr. Alain Bouchard of Cardiology Specialists of Birmingham, Alabama, at St. Vincent's Medical Center, part of Ascension.
Today, our podcast is on healthy lifestyle. And I have to tell you that a few months ago, my daughter, who's a nurse in Phoenix, Arizona, asked me, "Dad, why don't you do a podcast on preventing heart disease?" And I knew exactly the person to ask to be on that podcast because she's just like the primary prevention guru. She is the president-elect of the American College of Cardiology and Preventive Heart Disease. She's also the chairperson for CardioSmart and editor-in-chief. Her name is Martha Gulati, and she's one of my favorite Canadian cardiologists. So, Martha, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, we know that we're still looking for the fountain of youth. We know that through medical research and advance in medical care, we've been able to extend life and reduce morbidity and mortality. There's been a steady decline in cardiovascular mortality in men since the 60s, and in women only since 2000. But all that was interrupted in 2015 when we saw actually an increase in mortality and morbidity. And we felt like in part, it was probably due to this obesity pandemic. 2020 may be an interesting time as well, as we'll see what happens to cardiovascular disease, but probably some increase in morbidity and mortality last year. So we know that chronic disease directly impacts quality of life and results in morbidity and also disability. So how can we extend life free of disease? Can we do this using healthy lifestyle? Martha, what do you think?
Well, I really do think that because, we've even seen in this COVID pandemic, we've seen, the people that were more susceptible to COVID were the people that are more susceptible to heart disease, the same risk factors present. So ultimately, I think what we're talking about for preservation of health in general is keeping a healthy lifestyle. And it's something that we talk about easily, but we don't do as well. And I'm saying that we don't do it as well as physicians. We aren't good at telling our patients what to do, giving them the power to make good decisions at home and make these changes that we all need in our life.
So could you tell us a little bit what is a healthy lifestyle? Maybe you could break it down for us.
Yeah, when we talk about the ABCs of prevention, of primary prevention, and primary prevention, just to make it clear, that is when you have risk factors or you're susceptible for disease. And that's where we want to really start changing lifestyle. Ideally, primordial prevention comes even before that we just are born and we always do everything right. But we know that's not always the case. And I think we can make changes there in our society, but that's more comes from public policy changes. But primary prevention is the people that we have the ability to change their trajectory for good health versus poor health. And that when we identify somebody at risk, we should be guiding them. So for the ABCs of primary prevention include first knowing if you're at risk. That's the A, assessment of your risk. B is blood pressure. We should know what your blood pressure is. If it's elevated, we need to treat it. And when I say treat it, there's lifestyle and there's medications. The C stands for both cholesterol, and the other C is for cigarettes. So, we don't want anyone to smoke, but if someone does smoke, we need to help them to quit smoking. Also with cholesterol, we need to know what people's cholesterol is. That is one of the, keys to preventing heart disease. But if we don't know your number, we don't know what we're dealing with. The D stands for both diet and weight, because they're so interconnected, and diabetes. And E stands for exercise. So all of those are ABCDEs of prevention. And that's what we need to be spending time talking about with our patients so that they can be equipped for every one of those.
So basically, we have these lifestyle factors. We've got the smoking, we've got the weight, we have exercise, we have healthy diet, and maybe some moderate alcohol intake, which I guess we'll talk a little bit more. If you could tell us a little bit, Martha, what is the data telling us? There was this wonderful study of the nurse health study that followed these women, for 30, 40 years almost. And also that was combined with the health professionals that follow thousands of patients looking at their lifestyle. What was the result of these studies? What is it teaching us?
Yeah, the more we see from all these studies is that the people that adhere to a more healthy lifestyle versus those who don't have better outcomes. They're less likely to die from any cause. They're less likely to die of cardiac causes, and they're less likely to have a heart attack. And those we talk about those as the big endpoints that we really care about, right? Because we want to live healthy lives, but we want to live also long. And we don't want to have cardiac events. And heart disease is the number one killer of both men and women. So that's why all-cause mortality for our community is a really good measure. So when you see a study or an intervention that shows that, that's significant and very important. And we've had so many studies. And even when what's amazing about those studies is even when we very loosely define the healthy life, with very minimal measures, maybe things that you and I might be, but that's not exactly the guidelines. They're not even doing that. But we say, okay, we'll say that if they exercise, for a small amount of time, we'll count that. Guess what? When they do those things and, have at least a partially healthy diet versus someone who does none of those things, they have a better outcome. So it isn't an all or nothing game either. And that's the one thing I think that's important for people to understand. It can become the all later, but even just making small changes in your life can have a significant impact. I mean, I know we're going to talk about it, but activity, for example, we used to say very strictly, you've got to do, either 150 minutes of exercise a week of moderately intense activity. And now we've changed that. The prevention guidelines that came out in 2019 basically said, yes, those guidelines are fine, but do something rather than nothing. That's better. And that there was this linear increase. The more you did, the better your outcome was. But that we should be getting away from maybe saying do so much, because for some people, just getting them to move or do some activity is better than sitting on the couch the entire day or sitting in your chair the entire day.
Pretty amazing. Some of these results in the nurse health study, if you were looking at the woman at 50 years old, if you had zero health factors, you probably were going to have an event within the next 10 to 20 years, versus if you were just compliant and doing everything you need to do, exercise, eat right, you could extend, your life expectancy about 30 to 40 years. Pretty amazing what it can do. Very, very powerful. And not only women, also in men. There was a Swedish, study showing that men had the same effect, increase their life expectancy. Problem we have, Martha, is only 2% of Americans conform to healthy lifestyle. So we have really some work to do, don't we?
Yeah, we talk about the Life Simple 7 and the things that, everyone should be doing. And in terms of, all those risk factors we talked about. And the one thing that in the United States that we specifically do the worst out of all those 7 measures that we talk about is our diet. Our diet seems to be the real thing in the United States that is killing us. We're literally eating to die because they're rather than dying to eat. But it's interesting because that is one thing where we see it in our children when they do the assessment on them in the population, and we see it in adults. And this is what I really believe is driving those numbers you started with, where we're seeing heart disease increase mortality in the United States. And it's in younger people predominantly. We're losing the battle. The statistics just came out for, life expectancy in the United States, and we've lost ground. We've lost ground in the United States. That should not be happening.
All right, well, let's get started. We have probably 5 lifestyle factors we need to talk about. And of course, the big one is smoking, because it's been there for quite a while. And it's probably one of the most modifiable as well as incredible repercussion on our health. So what's bad about smoking, Martha? And then, let's talk about how do we quit?
Yeah, and this is the one thing that we as physicians, I would say, do very poorly. We don't talk a lot about it with our patients. We're not good at helping our patients quit. And yet it is the leading cause of cardiovascular disease. When you smoke, you have such a greater risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And why that is there's damage to the arteries that occurs as a result of smoking. An increase also in atherosclerosis as a result. There's changes to your lipid profile, your cholesterol, particularly the good cholesterol seems predominantly affected by people who smoke cigarettes. So this is something that, at every visit, for patients who smoke, I'll just tell you, I know it's uncomfortable, but it's something that we should be talking about, because your physicians can really help you quit smoking. The problem is often we don't spend that much time. We just say the words, "You should quit smoking."
Yeah, it's easy to say, not easy to do.
No.
When we look at what the smokers take with each puff of cigarette, I mean, the nicotine, not only nicotine in there's about 70,000 chemicals, 70 of which cause cancer. So it's really incredible that, the damage that you can see, occurring with smoking. And so how do we quit, Martha? I mean, it's, the patient want to ask you, let's have a conversation about quitting. I mean, I'm interested in quitting. What should I do?
Well, let's hope that it starts if the patient initiates the conversation, but we as providers feel like we should be asking. And we put out a document actually in 2018 that really gave a pathway and sort of advice for our medical community, because really nothing had been put out in years, really, to help guide physicians. But it should start with us always asking our patients, do you smoke? Or if you were a former smoker, just also asking if you've restarted smoking. The next step is for us to actually assess how much you smoke and to really know the number of cigarettes you smoke a day and the time that it takes you to smoke. Well, time meaning your first cigarette. So does it happen right away when you wake up? Tells us a little bit about your addiction to nicotine versus somebody who can wait longer, and that helps decide right medications as well. And then if people have quit, we should be talking about what was your prior experience in quitting, so that we know what might have partially worked or what failed for you. The next step for us as physicians is for us to give you advice about quitting and offering and connecting you to treatment. And because there's a lot of treatment and we can go through that, but we need to do more than just say quit smoking. We need to give the counseling, and we need to offer that up front and see if you as the patient are ready to quit, like if you accept that advice or if you decline it. It's okay if you're not ready to quit smoking, but we should bring it up at every visit, because you never know, we need you to be engaged to quit, but we never know what will be the switch on moment for that individual. And when they know that a physician's engaged with your ability to quit smoking and want to help you, that can sometimes motivate you to do it. You realize that there's a reason they're asking you always about it, and that they actually have therapy that maybe you've not tried before. So that's my approach as a physician. And I think, ultimately there's a bunch of questions we ask about the readiness of somebody being willing to quit, and all these different resources that we have. But the readiness is the biggest thing, I think, that helps us get to know if you're really, if this is the time to quit.
Well, I think that's very important, because, I mean, obviously it's never too late to stop. And it seems like the effect of smoking cessation starts immediately. I mean, you have a lower blood pressure, as well as lower heart rate just within a few hours of stopping your cigarette smoking. And within a year, you halve your risk of heart disease, which is pretty powerful. So it seems like there is kind of a physiological, a nicotine dependence, and then there's the behavioral, portion of the smoking and smoking cessation. How do we actually help the patient with their nicotine dependence? I mean, what kind of formula do you use? I mean, there's all kinds of, nicotine, product out there. Some are short acting, some long acting. And there's even some other, compound that are being used, like Wellbutrin. I guess we'll talk about that. What is the formula that has worked well for you that we could use for our patients?
Well, I think, every one of them has a role. There is the nicotine replacements, of which we have many different forms. We have patches, we have gums, we have lozenges, we have a nasal spray, and we have an oral inhaler. So they all have, they all have an expense with it, unfortunately, because depending on your insurance, it's unlikely to be covered unless, I will tell you, sometimes your state or where you work might do specific things because they want to help you quit smoking. But nicotine replacement is certainly part of it. And then the other part is the pharmacologic side. The bupropion or Chantix is another drug that we use. Bupropion, people know as Zyban or Wellbutrin, either one, they're the same thing. And, for everyone, it might be a little bit different. My preference is really using Chantix first and foremost, but there's some things that you have to know about both drugs. And I think that, again, everybody, you have to work with that individual to understand, why they might have a problem with something or another. For example, things like Wellbutrin, if people have a history of seizures, you would never use that drug. Another example, Chantix, it's great. If people don't eat a lot, though, like if there's somebody who just doesn't eat a lot of food, although sometimes that changes when they're trying to quit smoking, they can get a lot more nausea with it. If they have any renal issues as well, you have to at least be careful about the dosing. But otherwise, I think that Chantix is usually the drug that I like to start with. But for some patients, they don't want to take those. And so they, I understand that. So then we need to work with them with the nicotine replacement in the form that they feel comfortable with. I find that the gum works well, or the lozenges, because there's something very connecting about the oral side of it, replacing the oral portion of the cigarette. And I find more success with that than using the patch, to be honest with you. I haven't used the sprays often, the inhaler or the sprays. Often the cost has been the biggest prohibitive side of those things. But again, we did something novel when I was at Ohio State University. We were able to get our government our state government to pay for the replacement. And it was a short couple of years, but while we had it, it was a great incentive because people didn't need to pay for these. And we had a team, a smoking cessation team that worked with me, a bunch of pharmacists that were fantastic. And that helped because it helped with the close contact that you need. I think when someone's quitting smoking, one of the hardest parts is keeping on track and feeling like you have that support system both at home but externally, being accountable, and having a team really made a difference. So that's another part of smoking cessation that people don't really talk about, but it is about creating that support system, which includes your family, and sometimes means that your partner may need to quit smoking too, which is not always easy. They may not be motivated even when you're motivated. And secondhand smoking is part of the sort of risk equation that we say puts you at risk for potentially rebounding or going back to cigarettes, even when you're trying and getting very successful with quitting. If you're in a home that there's still other cigarettes, all the things that are maybe tempting are physically present to you, and it makes it a little bit harder. The other part of that equation, though, like I said, is behavioral support. And that, I would say, is probably our weakest link because we don't always have that in our communities where we can provide that. If you're lucky, like when we started a smoking cessation clinic, we were able to provide all of that, the behavioral and psychological part of the treatment and and like I said, the very close follow-up. And it's not always possible for your primary care physician or your cardiologist to have those things in place. So really look at your own health insurance because they may offer that in some way to you, and you may not be aware of it. It may be, now that we're doing so many things virtual, it may be a virtual option, but to connect with somebody is probably a big part of this equation that people will need to be successful about quitting. So, and then you asked me, I think you asked me something else, and I might have gone a little sidetrack on you. I apologize.
So let's say, for example, you have a patient that you want to start. He's interested in stopping, smoking. Yeah. You'll use, for example, either something like Chantix or a long-acting kind of nicotine patch, for example.
Yeah. So
one or the other.
It depends where I'm meeting them. So as an outpatient, when people are, after we meet them after a heart attack, I have a little different. I start them there on a nicotine patch to help relieve their withdrawal. And then on discharge, I would ask them, do they want to continue with the nicotine replacement therapy, or we can consider Chantix. If it's outpatient, I definitely start usually with Chantix, but sometimes I will do it with some nicotine replacement. Those are my first line drugs, depending on the location. My next choice will be things like Wellbutrin or a single nicotine replacement by itself. And then my third line drug is things like nortriptyline, which I don't use a lot of, but, and it's not actually FDA approved for smoking cessation, but it certainly is an option that even our scientific statement that came out would be that also their recommendation as well. So, and then the combination of drugs together can be the way to help people. If they failed on one of those, I might suggest we use a combination with the nicotine replacement, or even sometimes Chantix with Wellbutrin can be a good combination that can be effective.
And so you could use, for example, a nicotine patch combined with more of a short-acting, like a nicotine gum or lozenge or even a spray, just as needed, or a combination of Chantix and the short-acting nicotine replacement. That kind of combination works pretty good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, that's wonderful. It's still a challenge. And as you said, I think to have the support in place is very, very important. Now, you know that we're going to have to talk a little bit about vaping. The very controversial. I have another good friend in Canada, Dr. Martin Junot at the Montreal Heart Institute, and he's not so much against vaping because, he's seen a lot of smokers kicking the habit. Of course, now they're vaping and sometimes with a little bit of nicotine or even without nicotine. There was some bad publicity, of course, about the vaping, particularly when it was associated, had some THC in it. It caused some pulmonary disease. It caused even some death. And there's also the concern that you're trading, one disease or one habit for another. In the study, I think published in the New England, a year later, 80% of the patients were still vaping, versus only 10% were using nicotine replacement. Certainly, and I think we can say that in the young adults, in the youth, there's been a decrease in smoking, from 2011 to 2019, for example, number of smokers have gone from 15% to barely 6%. Of course, the vaping, now you have, these young kids, about 20 to 30% now are vaping, and who knows what's in it. So.
That's, I think, our biggest problem. Like, it's funny, prior to COVID, we were all worried about e-cigarettes, and then our focus quickly changed, right? Because our world changed so dramatically. But we were talking a lot about these e-cigarettes and, the risks, and even our recommendations aren't really, these devices are not approved by the FDA as a smoking cessation product. But there is some evidence that in people that are heavy smokers, that e-cigarettes can reduce, especially when they had heart disease, as a study out of Montreal showed, that they were helpful to get people to quit. But the problem was really, did we just substitute one form of nicotine for another form? But there can, I think that this is why we need the FDA more involved in the development of these devices, because of all the chemicals and other things that we can't regulate in these things that are being sold, makes it very hard to get an effective delivery. To me, it's in some ways a physical form similar to a cigarette, but that you could deliver nicotine, which is what we're doing with all the nicotine replacement items. But this is so physically like a cigarette that you do imagine that it can be more somehow soothing to somebody who's trying to quit, and even be used in a similar way and hopefully lower the doses. But we can't even control the amount of nicotine in these devices, which makes them a little problematic. For the younger people, what the biggest problem with these e-cigarettes to me is that, yes, younger people and people in general, the cigarette smoking is going down, which is great. And that's a wonderful thing. But for younger people, they are substituting, unfortunately, with they're using way more. I think the statistic right now is that 1 in 5 high school students are using vaping in some format. And so that to me is an epidemic. I mean, that is something we got to be concerned about when we don't even know what's in these products. And then it's very hard. Like you said, there's people that are using these long term. What is that? We're creating addiction, especially to kids. And people that say that these e-cigarettes aren't being made for children, then why are they putting flavors in these products that are really designed and targeted to children? And so that's where the whole American Heart Association, came out, I guess it was in late 2019, where the anti-vaping movement was to, try to get kids to understand that this was really targeting them and getting them addicted to a substance, which we just shouldn't want. So I think the conversation isn't over about e-cigarettes. I think if it could be a really good delivery form, if we could control what's in them and know what's in them.
Very good point. Well, I think this is the chapter of smoking. That's a big one. Fortunately, we're seeing less and less, smokers. And, I guess all this effort that has been put together over the last 10 to 20 years is paying off to some extent. It's not over yet, but, it's progressing very nicely. Now, let's talk about the other pandemic that has been going on, over the last, 10 years, and it's obesity and the weight. We know that obesity is bad, right? I mean, it causes heart disease, hypertension, elevates your cholesterol, causes heart failure, myocardial infarction, diabetes, sleep apnea. It causes even cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer. It causes chronic pain, dementia, depression.
Yeah.
Tell us, I mean, this is a major problem, and yet we have a third of our population. I mean, that's like, I think it was something like 28 million, people that have obesity, and an additional 40 to 50 million that have pre-diabetes that are actually metabolic syndrome and so forth. How do we address that? First of all, let's define a little bit obesity, if you don't mind, Martha, and let's talk about the BMI. I guess that's a way to evaluate this problem, isn't it?
Yeah. BMI, or body mass index, is basically a measurement that we use to tell basically if you're too short for your weight. And unfortunately, as adults, we can't really get taller, or I haven't figured out a way to get taller. So, the way we measure it is the measurement is kilogram per meter square, which is a metric form, even though in the US we use pounds and height, and pounds as weight, and height is in inches. But it's basically, we calculate it for individuals, and obesity is defined as a BMI greater than 30 kilograms per meter square. And it's easy. You can go on to, if your doctor hasn't told you what your body mass index is, if you know your height and weight, you can enter it onto like many different calculators that will just spit out your BMI for you online. So it's pretty easy for you to figure it out. And we want your BMI to be under 25 kilogram per meter square, which is normal body mass index. When it's between 25 and 30, that's overweight. And when it's greater than 30, it's obese. And now in the United States, it's closer to 40% of people are now obese. And we've been watching it. I mean, you remember when they started making those maps of the United States, and, there were some states that were not doing well, and then the others were okay. And then it just started growing. And just like the epidemic that we're seeing of obesity, it just got worse, and it continues to get worse. And this is where we were talking before about the diet being so bad in the United States. We're consuming more calories, we're sitting more. All of these things go together with weight. It's diet and exercise. And of course, it's affected by our metabolism and our genetics. But a big portion of what we're seeing is changes in our regular life patterns and what we choose to eat that is affecting our society. And it's a huge issue. And I know for those people out there who struggle with their weight, it's not an easy issue, and we're not blaming anyone, but it is something that affects your health and your heart health specifically, but your overall health, to be honest, is affected by your weight. And it can affect your joints, you're carrying more, so therefore your body's doing more work. It affects your heart. It affects all kinds of things that if we could have prevented it, that would have been better. But dealing with it is a much harder issue. So, I mean, it needs to be talked about. I know a lot of patients, they will say some of my patients don't want to step on the scale. Some don't want me to tell them their weight. It's a touchy subject, but I will tell you, without knowing your weight means we can't even address it. And don't feel that your doctor is judging you. We have so many patients, and some people of ourselves struggle with weight. So what we need to do is tackle it together. And that's the best way, is to talk with your doctor and ask what can be done, because we actually have some exciting news. I mean, not everything, of course, we can talk. I know we're going to talk about different diets, but there is even actually an exciting new medication that was just published last week that gives us some hope that we could help our patients with potentially a drug that might help them get some weight off. And there's a lot of different things we can do, but we have to talk about it, because I think even doctors are scared to bring it up in their offices for the fear of alienating their patients and making them self-conscious of their weight. I always blame the body mass index. I blame the score. I'm like, it says you're obese. I don't say you're obese, but we have, basically it's the calculation. And for some people, BMI isn't perfect. Really tall people, their BMI will come out high, and we can understand that they're just a bigger person, and there's actually not as much fat on them, and there's not weight to be lost. Similarly, though, people from different ethnicities, the BMI may be fine, and I may still be telling them, and this is from my own ancestry, I can tell them that as a South Asian, you're at a greater risk of heart disease, even though your BMI looks fine, because there's different measures we'll talk about of fat, but carrying weight around the center of your tummy is also puts you at a greater risk. And so these are things that are so important for us to be talking about with everyone, and for everyone to know what should they do about their weight.
I love your expression that you used in past conferences to define a little bit better this belly fat or central obesity is, when you enter a room and that your belly precedes the rest of your body, that's the belly fat for you. But you're right, when it's bad, visceral fat actually kind of releases hormones that can promote inflammation, and therefore, interferes with the way other hormones work, like insulin. So it causes heart attack, all kinds of problems. But, when we tell our patient, listen, Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so, your BMI is 35 or even 40, we need to lose weight. Well, that's another one, like saying you need to quit smoking. It's easy to say, not easy to do. How do you actually walk through with your patient? You're in the office. How do you get them started? Or someone that really wants to lose weight, how do you approach that?
The best approach is obviously with a dietitian. I will tell you that most of us as physicians, we might have been lucky if we had 1 or 2 or 3 lectures on diet. And I was trained at University of Toronto, where we actually had one of the best persons who researches diets on faculty there. And we were lucky. We did get a fair amount about diet, but we don't come out really equipped to tell people. I think this is one of the failings of medical school, but that's a different conversation. But I think if you can be lucky and partner with a dietitian, that can really help. Unfortunately, in the US, the only way a dietitian is generally paid for is if you already have diabetes, which I would say that's too late. I mean, definitely they need help with their diet, but we should be more proactive and more pro-prevention. And if you have chronic kidney disease, then you can get the dietitian involved. Otherwise, you have to pay for the dietitian. Now, the good news that has happened during this pandemic is there's so much availability online, and even consulting with a dietitian virtually is one of the many options that can be very cost effective and give you a kickstart. But, it's certainly something to consider. But I think in general, if the only person you can go to is a cardiologist or your primary care physician, you should ask them for information. Now, I did want to make a plug for CardioSmart. We have some information on cardiosmart.org. It's free to anyone. And at least there's some information and resources there that can lead you to other resources about diet. So that's one place you can go. The American Heart Association has some great information. But I think what we need to do is chat first about, well, what do you eat? And one of my first questions I ask people, everybody actually gets asked this in my clinic, is I ask, what did you eat yesterday? That's my diet recall. And usually the way the conversation goes is this. They say, oh, but yesterday wasn't a typical day. Now, if it was your birthday, I might forgive you. But otherwise, you start realizing that the not so typical day is actually their typical day. So I literally want to know, what did you eat for breakfast in detail? Drank as well, snacks. What did you eat for lunch? Then snacks, and then dinner. And if there's an evening snack or dessert, I want it all. I write it down, and I at least get it's almost like taking a picture of my patient. And at least there we can start saying, okay, well, if just every day you replaced, say your bacon and eggs and waffle, maybe we can change that to oatmeal. Maybe that's the only thing we change right now. Significant calorie reduction, greater fiber intake, and we talk about where is the places that we can make these little changes. That can be the start of helping them change their diet. If they're, again, person has to be engaged with that, but I always bring it up. Well, when at the end of my visit, regardless of why anyone's there, can there be any lifestyle changes we can do together? And what do we want to focus on? And I try to keep it to one change per visit, because I know if I write down everything, they're not going to do it. It'll seem overwhelming. But making one change is a reasonable thing, because when you make that a habit, if you start with that, then the next time you're more willing to engage with, okay, what should we change? I have patients who come in, okay, what are we changing at this visit? And then we find something. So I think that can be a helpful way. I know that you probably want to talk a little bit more, though, about I think the biggest thing out there is all the diets that are out there. And I always tell people, I don't really want anyone on a diet. I just want you to eat healthy. So that terminology that we use, what diet is the best, I hope everyone realizes that we're not talking about even weight loss. Just what should you be eating when we're saying, Mediterranean diet or DASH diet? We're just talking, what should you be eating? Not that we're putting you on a diet to help you lose weight. If you're trying to lose weight, then we should talk about the calories that you're eating within any changes we're trying to make.
Well, I think that's really good. The portions that the patients eat, finish your plate like your mom, taught you when you were a kid. And now we're really trying to tell them, why don't you just eat 80% of what's in your plate, and try to maybe obviously have more healthy choices. What's on the plate is important too.
And little things that you can do, even, changing. A lot of us are, I don't know if people ever look at their grandmother's china. They'll notice that the dining plates were actually quite small. And now we go to Crate and Barrel and these other stores, and the plates are just massive. They often don't even fit in your cupboards. So, depending on when's the last time you modified your kitchen, if it's been a while, you'll realize the bigger plates in the older cupboards, they don't shut. You have to be very creative about how you place them. And one of the tricks that you can simply do to reduce what you're taking in is use your smaller plate. So use either your salad plate instead of the big dining plate. It's probably not that much smaller than what would be the original dining plate of what people used to eat on. But now we're just so used to these massive quantities. And again, on the resources we have at CardioSmart, we talk about what portion of your plate should really be vegetables, and if your protein, where that should be, and the other parts of your meal. And just following some of these simple tricks, you can almost fool yourself that you're full because you ate that whole plate. I think another thing that we do very wrong, and I talk with my patients about this, is where do they eat, especially their lunch and maybe their breakfast. If they eat it on the go versus actually sitting down, it makes a big difference to feeling full. And I think we're all guilty of it. I mean, I know how many lunches I've eaten at my desk, and and doing multitasking, doing lots of other work. And am I full? I don't even know if I realized what I ate for that meal. So simply taking out the 10 or 15 minutes, whatever you need to sit down, drink a proper glass of water before you eating your food, enjoying it. I think the French know how to do this better. They actually enjoy the meal, the socialization, who they're sitting with, and they enjoy their food. And it's partially about the food, but it's not portions like we eat. And so just trying little tricks can help you consume a little bit less. Not eating in front of the television is another thing that, I try to get my patients to think about this so that they make it more about the meal and looking at their food, appreciating their food, and not eating, but not even noticing the amount they ate. And that, I think, can be a lot about simply reducing your calorie intake, which ultimately weight loss is about trying, we always say this expression, you can't outrun a bad diet. And you really can't. You can exercise a lot, but I'll tell you, if you're taking more calories than your body needs, you'd have to run or do whatever exercise for many hours, sometimes for the 3,000, 4,000 calories that people are putting in per day into their life, even with just the, Starbucks and coffees that are so sweetened. Those are, if you just simply get rid of those or just go to black coffee or something like that, you can make a big difference to how many calories. Sodas is another one where just wasted calories, where I'd rather get those from food. And you just need to be talking with your doctor and kind of keeping a record can really help you go, gosh, what am I eating? Like when you keep track, a lot of these apps on our smartphones and stuff, when they're good is they're counting every calorie from what you eat. And if you truly just follow for a week and enter all your food, you'll stop eating bad things because you'll realize that, like MyFitnessPal, you can scan every food you're eating and it knows the calories. And you realize, oh gosh, if I eat this whole thing, like how many calories it would be. And you're like, okay, even you stop eating the whole chocolate bar, or, even sometimes certain things you'll be like, oh, I don't need that as much as I need whatever I wanted to eat tonight. So that's their science behind them, is just being aware of the calorie intake.
A very good point. I think here in the U.S., we nationalized the buffet food, all you can eat for $5.99. Can go twice, 2 helpings, 3 helpings, as well as very large portion, So obviously, we're not going to talk about all the diets here, but, there's the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, the vegetarian diet, and then you have like these keto diets, Atkins diet, which, was kind of back then, of course, poor Dr. Atkins, died of a heart attack just because, it was like, low calorie, but, bad food. So what is the advice we could give our patient in terms of healthy, diet? How do we advise them to eat healthy? I mean, what's in the Mediterranean diet, for example, that is so good?
Yeah, so the recommendations from the American Heart Association, which were put into the prevention guidelines that came out in 2019, were that either a plant-based or Mediterranean diet were the ones that they recommended. And, that generally means, if we're talking a Mediterranean diet, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, lean proteins. So whether that's vegetable or animal protein, preferably fish, would be the ideal diet. And then insoluble vegetable fibers that are ingrained in that kind of diet as well. The Mediterranean diet specifically also emphasizes the use of olive oil. The plant-based diets are good too. There's a lot of studies on those as well, but the strongest ones for the Mediterranean diet, like the PREDIMED, is one of the studies that randomized participants either to the Mediterranean diet that was supplemented either with olive oil or nuts, And when they supplemented with either of those two, along with the Mediterranean diet, we saw about a 30% reduction in having a heart attack, having a stroke, or dying from cardiovascular causes. But in general, it seemed that it was really driven primarily by a reduction in stroke. So that really gave us a lot of information. I think that also when we looked at plant-based studies versus animal protein, like the two protein sources, there's the Adventist Health study, and they looked at that using meat as protein versus plant. And what they saw was those people who got the protein from meat, there was actually about a 60% greater increase in dying from any cause. Compared to those people who had it from, took their protein from plant-based formats. And there's other studies as well, but I think those are the ones that I really recommend when patients ask, what should I be eating? Or what kind of diet plan should I be eating on a daily basis? Now, there's the DASH diet too that I'm a big fan of, and especially for people with high blood pressure. It's very Mediterranean-like, although it has a little bit more focus on, it also allows dairy intake as well. And a lot of people think the DASH diet also had low salt, but actually the DASH diet in and of itself was really about what you were eating, and high fruits and vegetables, high potassium containing vegetables was the recommendation in the DASH diet. And when people followed that, it was specifically looking at, did it have the ability to lower blood pressure? And it really had a great effect. And then if you added to the DASH diet reduction in sodium as well as the DASH diet, you got an even more profound effect on lowering the blood pressure. So I think that those are the ones that I really recommend to people based on what can they do. I'm plant-based. And when I say plant-based, I think that even the Mediterranean diet's plant-based. It's just making a decision if you're going to go all plant-based, which, might mean vegan, versus just adding more plants to your food. And I am pro plant-based for all my patients because I want them to get in some plants into their diet. And like I said, I ask everyone, what do you eat? And you'll be amazed at how many people don't list any vegetable in that day snapshot, or maybe one vegetable, and that's all they get. And that's not what we're recommending people really eat. They need way more plants in their diet. So I think everyone needs to be plant-based. It's just a question of what can you do in terms of your choices, in terms of your protein sources, maybe substituting for healthier. If you're going to eat animal products, I have no problem with it, but maybe you can consume fish sometimes, and maybe you can consume lower fat meats. I think that's where we need to work with. Now, for you mentioned the other diets that are out there, and I think they're so important to talk about because we get these questions all the time about Atkins, the ketone diet, I'm probably forgetting the Ornish diet, and what are the benefits, what are the pros, Esalen diet as well. There's been a lot of hype about that as well. And so let me first go to they're all extreme diets, but the Ornish diet and the Esalen diet is no fat. And so one thing I will tell you, it's very hard for people to adhere to. I would say the data is very much lacking in those two. I know when you look up Dr. Ornish's diet, I don't mean to trash his diet because he published a lot, but what he published is, to me, not enough to convince me that it's the right diet. So one of his studies had, I think, 43 patients enrolled in his study. 20 were not in his diet arm, 23 were in his diet arm, highly motivated group in that 23 group. Took them a lot of people to find before they got enough that were going to be compliant. Very different type of people too in the two groups. And then he said that he found a difference with using quantitative coronary angiography, that there was reversal of disease. That reversal of disease was 0.001 millimeter. And we don't use, as you know, you're the interventionalist, not me, that we don't use quantitative coronary angiography. So yeah, back in that day when he did those studies, I don't know if we were using IVUS. We certainly weren't using it as frequently, but now I would say that's the way to really detect disease. And he touts that his disease or his diet is the only diet out there that has proven reversal, because he had a statistical significant finding. I don't buy it. And I think the other thing is it's very hard, small numbers, but very hard for patients to adhere. And I would argue it's a big marketing tool. So hopefully he doesn't listen to this, but then the same with the Esalen diet is, again, very hard to adhere. And it contradicts these big studies that he's not done a study, but these big studies with the Mediterranean diet, Lyon study, I could quote so many different studies that have shown us that we can have improved outcomes with the Mediterranean diet. So I don't think that eliminating olive oil is a good thing. I don't think eliminating avocados and fish from your diet is a good thing. We need some of those fats, and there's some fats that are good for us. And I think the saturated fats, we can all agree, are not good for us. The trans fats, we can all agree, are not good for us. The other diets that everybody definitely talks about, though, are the keto diet right now. South Beach, also known as South Beach diet, is one of them. The Atkins diet, I would argue, was a similar one, where they were trying to show that a low carb diet or a high protein, but actually it was a really high fat diet, improves outcomes. We don't have data showing that it improves cardiovascular outcomes. It may accelerate weight loss in the short term, but even that is of some debate. There is just a beautiful study that was put out it was published, I know maybe the senior author was Kevin Hall from the NIH, and it was published in Nature. And how many times do you see a diet study in Nature? But he did this elegant study where people didn't even know what kind of study they were in. He wanted to just see the biochemistry effects of basically a keto diet versus a low-fat diet that was plant-based. And the people that were on the low-fat plant-based diet, even though the weight loss was not the goal, and actually they consumed a lot of calories because they were brought every meal. And so when it's in front of you, you might eat it. They could certainly not eat. There was no push on them to eat or not, but they had to bring them the food. So there was a high calorie intake. The people that lost weight were this was a crossover design. When they lost weight, they were more likely to be on the plant-based diet than the keto diet. So, it's not consistent with what I think people think. But if people need a kickstart to their weight loss and they really think that the keto diet's going to do it, then, for people with cardiac disease, especially, I always warn them that the biggest problem with that is the amount of fat that you end up taking based on those strict diets. If you maybe modify it a little bit and get high protein from plant-based food, that might be a better choice, or from things like fish. And it just really depends what you're doing. But it's I think I actually have someone for you that you should really have a great diet discussion about all these diets, because I think it is very interesting. And a lot of what I think our patients hear is the marketing out there, trying to get people to be on these diets. And again, when we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, I'm talking about a lifestyle. So you can have a bad day and, on your birthday celebrations, things where you eat something differently. But if most of your days is following the Mediterranean lifestyle, you will actually do better. You really will, because that's what we've seen in our studies. And diet studies are the hardest to do because you have to collect everything on everything that they eat. And these diaries that we collect are very difficult and they're imperfect at best. But when you see that kind of, even with them being imperfect, and you see these great reductions in cardiovascular events and mortality, it's impressive.
I think we have something in the South. We don't have a very good diet, in the South. Southern cooking and having a lot of processed meat and processed food, a lot of fat and everything. So I think if we could avoid the processed food and the fat containing in them, the fried food, the added fat, the organ meat that we see here, the sweet into everything, sweet tea and so forth, which is just kind of markers of Southern diet, which is really increasing the prevalence of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease.
Yeah, definitely. There was that study called the Regard Study, which specifically pointed out that the Southern diet plan, or, the dietary pattern that they have, was identified at the greatest risk. They had a 56% greater risk for heart disease, a 30% greater risk of stroke. And the pattern that they saw in the South was more fried food, more added fats, more organ and processed meat, and those sugar sweetened beverages. And those were the things that they ultimately, after that study was done, saying that, we just need to figure out for the people that live in the southern areas, how to modify the food that you enjoy and make, but make it healthier. So, maybe like if you make fried chicken, for example, could you bake it? Now there's these great air fryers. They can make anything look like it's fried and actually have the crunchiness that sometimes our mouths like to have that texture. So that's one thing. I'm not a big fan of diet drinks per se, but I will say that a diet drink is better than a sugar sweetened drink. So if you have to substitute and go that way first, and then you can figure out if you can get away from it altogether. But making little modifications to the diet, particularly in the South, can be a huge game changer.
So is the diet drink like vaping?
Yes.
That was a great study that you mentioned. That was actually at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And that was done kind of a long time ago, and with very, very great findings. So it looks like the American Heart Association got rid of the food pyramid, and now we're talking about this plate. So could you tell us a little bit about, what's on the plate that we would recommend to our patients? You mentioned obviously a lot of good ingredients, but what are the categories that we put on the plate?
Yeah. So one thing is we emphasize a diet that is rich in vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts, whole grains, and fish. That we have evidence that those things, all of them have evidence that they decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease. Our next thing that we recommend is that we replace saturated fats with monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fats, and that we should have a diet that's got a reduced amount of total cholesterol, as well as a reduction in sodium can be beneficial to reduce your risk of heart disease. And then as part of that healthy diet, we also recommend a reduction or minimization of processed meats, refined carbohydrates, and sweetened beverages. And the last thing in our recommendations from diet is that as part of a healthy diet, you eliminate trans fats, that those should be avoided. We know that the data is strong that trans fats increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. And they're supposed to be listed on every food. We now have updated food labels on the things we buy. So they're on every food. And if you see that word trans fat, I would just put it back. And that comes from, I'm not sure if that's what you were talking about, but that's from our prevention guidelines, our 5 sort of ways of talking about diet. I have a big problem with the food pyramid. It's just heavily influenced by industries that lobby, and not that the government isn't trying, but I think it's just so heavily influenced that every time we see a food pyramid come out and they're not willing to say don't consume sugar, or they're not willing to move a bit away from the risks related to meat, from specific meats, we have a harder problem with that, with the food pyramid.
I think, Martha, we could do a podcast just on nutrition, and probably we should. So another way to lose weight is also to move more. We know that exercise is really good. It decreases stress, improves your sleep, improves your mood, improves your brain function, lowers your blood pressure, your LDL, it opens up blood vessel, improves balance, prevents falls in the elderly, decrease your blood sugar, prevents osteoporosis, decrease dementia. How come we're not all moving?
Yeah, that's a big problem. And it's going to be interesting after this pandemic is over to see how little we moved, or maybe some people moved more, but we've become even more sedentary for many of us, just the way that we've had to work. Even the difference between people not having to go into work or working remotely, even the walking that we might have done just to get to work has changed. So I don't know the answer entirely why we're not moving. I think our world is changing. Our types of work are changing, a lot more sitting at a computer. As a result, even when we get home, we're still, either whether you're on your phone, whether you're still doing work after work, our hours of sitting have just become prolonged. We send emails to people that might sit next to us. And so it's just, we can get things delivered. We don't need to, we don't do the things that people did it before. So I think this is the biggest problem. Now, in our guidelines, we actually talked about this because it's not just about the exercise that you do, that you intentionally do, but also just how much you move in general. And both matter, and both are significant, and both need to be tracked in terms of somebody who's trying to make a conscientious effort to do more activity. So I just started off, I think, by saying that, we recommend that you should do about 150 minutes of moderate intense activity a week, or 75 minutes of more intense, vigorous, much more vigorous physical activity. You can get away with less. But the reality is, what we're recommending is just do something every day. So if you're someone who doesn't exercise, try a little bit of something. Try something that you would do. And that can be even things around your house count. So whether you like gardening, whether you, do like have some hobby where you can be in your garage and you're standing, those things are actually equally important, as well as you finding an exercise and raising your heart rate. Ideally, you do both, but we should be asking more about also what are the things you do every day? How much walking do you do in a regular day, even if it's not intentionally exercise? People sometimes tell me that at their work, they're on their feet the entire day, and that actually does count and is important. So, but we want you to move more, and that is really a big issue for our society as a whole, and being very creative and intentional about getting exercise should be everyone's goal.
Well, certainly the sitting is the new smoking.
Exactly.
And, we need to get rid of the sitting. Certainly by sitting, you burn very little calories, maybe 1 calorie an hour, versus just standing, which is up to probably 5 to 7 calories an hour. And a lot of times we've been pushing these desks, that you can kind of lift, kind of adjustable. And instead of sitting all the time, you can be standing and doing some of your computer work that you need to do. And exercise is so important. So basically 30 minutes per day, 5 days a week is basically our recommendation. Do you have, we talk about moderate exercise. What kind of, you mentioned gardening, ballroom dancing, brisk walk. What else could we recommend?
Yeah. So, if you do yoga, that's something that we would consider the moderate activity. The way we define moderate is, again, how much oxygen or how much work does it take to do this activity? And so moderate activities are things like a brisk walk, biking, maybe 5 to 10 miles per hour, ballroom dancing, yoga, reasonably active yoga, recreational swimming. And so those kinds of activities are a good way of, finding something that you would like to do and enjoy doing and can do most days of the week. More vigorous activity is running or jogging, biking at maybe a higher speed than I mentioned before, playing tennis, so intentionally swimming laps. That's a more vigorous activity, but that's not to minimize, because at different ages we can do different things. That if somebody's doing some, walking and even golfing, I consider that more of a light activity. But something, like I said, is better than nothing. Because when we think about how we spend our day, just for people that don't know this at least was the data pre-COVID. And I'm thinking after COVID, during COVID, at least it's changed a little bit. Our amount of hours that we spend sedentary, really doing nothing, is about almost 8 hours a day. Then we sleep on average, not everybody sleeps 8 hours, but somewhere between 6 to 8 hours a day. And then the light stuff, the stuff that everyone tells me, like, okay, I walk at work, or I'm up about puttering in my kitchen, or, I'm preparing meals for my family, whatever. That's also about 7 to 8 hours a day. The amount of activity when people actually do intentionally exercise in the US, it's about 20 minutes for our whole population. That's not really great. But if you break down your day and you say, okay, I spend most of my time doing very little activity, making room for activity is a good thing. And the new guidelines that came out, we also emphasized, how do you get those 30 minutes a day? We used to say that at least 10-minute bouts would be ideal, but you know what? Now we've moved away from that. We have good data suggesting that even if you do it in smaller spurts, it's still a benefit. So whether that's being at work and you run up the stairs and that's one part of your activity that day, and then you do that multiple times, that's great. So keep adding up your time to be active, but don't think you can always make a few minutes for activity. It's just, where can you fit it in your day? And maybe you can't really find the 30 minutes in as a concentrated time, or even 10 minutes, but can you find 5 minutes? Can you find a couple minutes and just put them throughout your day? And that's a way to at least start fitting it in and not feel like it's a big burden. Because I know everybody's very busy and at different stages of our lives, whether you're taking care of small children, whether you're taking care of elderly parents or an elderly partner, we can all be busy. But and then our work in and of itself takes up a lot of time, but it's just finding where can you fit in everything and make it work to your lifestyle.
And usually the more, the better. It's as you know, Deanna, my wife, she does a triathlon, which is kind of swimming, biking, and running, at the end. And it's amazing to me every time I go to the award ceremony and I look at these individuals that have completed the triathlon, and I look at their age group, and all of them look like they're 10 years younger. So maybe exercise is the fountain of youth, maybe.
I think it is. I mean, we have such good, Deanna is like a superwoman. I don't know there's many people like her, but that group of people that do triathlons, I agree with you. I mean, they remain in such good shape, and they really don't. You see people doing this. I watched while I was in one, not the Olympic distance like Deanna does, but I was in the sprint one, and I watched a 99-year-old man finish, and I was like, kudos to him. He was just amazing. The more you do, that is the truth. There's this inverse linear relationship. The more you do, the less heart disease you're going to have, the longer you're going to live. So the more, we should all aim for more. but again, I don't want to discourage people that first of all, you can start at any age to start activity. There's no age too late, and you can get the benefits of exercise whenever you start. And some is better than none. And you'll start finding that once you start moving, you'll want to move more. You'll start, some people, if you're motivated by numbers, then, using a smartphone or a smartwatch or any of those Fitbits or apps that you can put on your phone that can track your steps, that can be a great way and a great motivator. Some people love that stuff. Other people will just like to know what time they left their house and when they came home. And either way, do something, get up and get moving, because it is really true that, if you don't use it, you lose it. And physical activity really is the definer for us. When we put people on treadmill tests, when we see how fit somebody is, it really tells us, we know right away that even if they already have heart disease, who's going to do well and who's not going to do well based on that. So that's why we push. I know a lot of people will say, I don't like exercise. Don't think of it then as exercise. Think about it as an activity that you're doing to preserve your health, and don't even call it exercise. It doesn't have to be the things we traditionally show images of people running or swimming and things that maybe you're not as comfortable with, but walking, cycling, stationary bicycles, yoga, Tai Chi, all of these activities can be really beneficial for you. And now, if you don't know how to do them, or you want to do them in the privacy of your home, this is the other thing. There's things online that you can access for free, many of them. Even the New York Times has the 6-minute workout that you can do anywhere. I use it when I travel sometimes, just as a way to make sure I did some resistance training. You can put it to whatever level you want, but it helps you just stay active no matter where you are.
That's great. Now, the next lifestyle factor we're going to talk about is alcohol. And of course, you're talking to a French Canadian. And, I have a lot of French in me, which means that I enjoy my wine. So what are the recommendations that we have for our patients?
Yeah, so a lot of people ask us, based on our recommendation related to alcohol, should everyone drink alcohol? No. If you don't drink, I don't recommend that you drink alcohol for cardiac protection. But right now, our recommendation is that, for men, they can drink up to 2 alcohol drinks per day. And for women, it should be 1 or under. And that's really got to do with body size. It's not bias or prejudice against women, but we do get gypped there. But here's where the exceptions are. For people with high blood pressure, one of the simplest things they can do to lower their blood pressure is actually either reduce their alcohol intake or stop it altogether. You can see a significant blood pressure drop, somewhere between 5 to 7 millimeters of mercury in your systolic blood pressure can fall as a result of stopping alcohol consumption. So, and then people with heart, if they already have heart disease, especially those with heart failure, they might get told to not drink very much. So you need to ask your physician, especially if you have heart conditions and if you have high blood pressure, about whether you should even be drinking alcohol or whether you should be reducing it. But I do think it's okay. There's some debate, where the French always want us to believe that, the French paradox is true, that although they eat well and drink well, they have less heart disease.
It's probably sponsored by Chateaubriand or
exactly. But I will argue that the French eat differently. As I might have just briefly said, that they eat differently. They don't eat the portions we eat either. Even when their food is very rich, they eat, if you go to France, which I love to do, it's small portions. It's yes, it's heavy, but it's so, it's a small part of your meal. And there's always vegetables, beautifully cooked, with not heavy, not with lots of oils or fat. So people really have to understand that there's a difference in the countries too. But the alcohol, it's definitely true. They do drink a fair amount of alcohol, and yet they do have a lower rate of heart disease. But I don't think that that's a reason to drink too much. I think it's, again, moderation. I think, and that is ultimately the key for everything, is moderation about what we eat and how we do things in our lives. Especially sitting, we should sit in moderation. We should be more active. But I think for alcohol intake, just be careful with it. And remember, your measurements may not be the same amount. We're heavy pourers when it comes to alcohol, and two glasses of wine is not the way that some people pour a glass of wine. In the US, again, I will say everything is a little bit, we're heavy-handed that way. So just be careful.
Really have a big glass.
Yes, we also have big glasses like we have big plates. So just be careful with the alcohol. And also think about it this way. If you are struggling, though, with weight, calories do come from alcohol. And so you may want, sometimes that can be very easy for you to quit. And you can say, well, I don't need it. I just drank it because I thought it was good for me. Maybe that's a simple change you can make where you're like, okay, I don't need it. And those are, calories that I don't need. And you can simply cut out calories. Remember, wine specifically, especially white wine, which I personally love, it is a little bit sweeter too. There's more sugars in it. So I always say, if you're going to drink the wine, you're maybe not going to be able to have the dessert. So just think about it that way.
I love it. It's true. A glass of wine is about between 100 and 150 calories. I have to run or walk on my treadmill at least 30 to 40 minutes just to burn that,
Exactly.
So it's the calories in the liquid, and you don't really see it. Well, let's talk a little bit about stress, because that's another life, factor that we need to kind of manage. We know that stress is bad. I mean, when you have stress hormone, it's chemical that promote inflammation. You have, extremes like stress cardiomyopathy, the Takotsubo. How do we manage stress? I mean, it's really not an easy one.
Yeah, stress is definitely, we've shown in so many different ways, the link of stress to heart disease, as you touched on. And I think that this is something we also don't do very well yet. Just like I was saying about smoking cessation, we might ask about your stress, but then we don't actually manage it for you. And it can be such an important link to whether we're talking about weight and people not being able to lose weight, because when your brain gives out these signals that you're stressed, there's an increase in cortisol, and then it makes it much harder for you to lose weight. And so, we need to manage it. I think one way to manage it is, of course, exercise can be a great way to manage it. But for some people, that's not enough. I think you doing things like meditation and sometimes through yoga or meditation by itself can be a great way to manage stress. And there is, evidence showing that yoga and Tai Chi and meditation can actually lower your blood pressure, which we know that can happen as a result of the stress, and all the hormones released in the body can raise your blood pressure. So finding techniques that can help you, as well as sometimes if you have severe stress, sometimes you need behavioral therapists to help you with that, to manage it. But the normal stress that we all live with, we do need to be able to manage in different ways. And so for me, I think the biggest thing is actually acknowledging that you have stress, because all of us have it in different ways. But what are you doing about it? And then if you're talking with people, whether that's your family or a therapist, that's great. And if that helps you deal with it. But sometimes these forms of exercise and meditation can really be beneficial to helping you manage it overall.
Now, the reality of our patient is not always that easy, Martha, as you know. I mean, we have these patients that come from low socioeconomic area, the single mother with a BMI of 40 that has to take care of 3 kids and to feed them, as well as, now they're at home, they can't go to school because of COVID. You recommend her to exercise, and I said, Doc, it's not that safe in my area. You try to get her, to eat some healthy food. They either live in the country where there is, this called food desert, and there's very little good food available. How do we deal with this? I mean, this is a big issue, isn't it?
This is the biggest issue. This is the platform on which everything we talked about depends on. We call these the social determinants of health, and they are the things that impact our health in ways that are perhaps the hardest to address. So it's where we're born, where we grow up, where we age, the places in which we work and live. All of these things affect our health and our well-being. So our childhood experiences, our housing and our housing stability, our education, our social support, because certainly some people have social support and some people don't, our income, our employment, and our greater community. And ultimately, all of that influences our access to healthcare and healthcare resources, and especially in the United States, even the availability of health insurance. And all of this makes it harder for us to achieve any of the things we talked about. If you don't have good health insurance, you may not even know you're at risk for certain things. Or when I say eat a healthy diet, you're like, you know what? And we know this is true. We actually have a paper that was just accepted to JAC specifically on to JAC case report about social determinants of health. We actually just said that, you can tell patients eat healthy, and then if it's cheaper to buy food that is unhealthy and not as cheap to buy fruits and vegetables, which one would you choose if your money's limited? If you don't have a preventive health care network because you don't have good health care, it affects you. So I think this is the challenge. I don't have an easy solution, sadly. When we talk about the prevention guidelines, if you look at them, they have this circle around it that basically say that social determinants of health determine all of this. But right now, there's no solution. I think if I had a magic wand and could change how we could improve health care to everyone, specifically addressing social determinants of health, one of the equities that I think healthcare is a right, not a privilege. If we could provide healthcare to everybody, that would be at least one of that equation. Maybe I can't change right now, all those other things that we talked about, but healthcare really should be something we're providing to everyone and equally. And there's definitely, we know in our system, there's different tiers of care. So if we really need to start talking about this as a medical community, or we will never save our population. We'll continue, as we're seeing a rise in heart disease mortality. We're not going to be able to address most Americans' health if we don't address this.
Not an easy problem. And I found that there's quite a bit of success working with churches, particularly in the South and the Southeast, where exercise programs are incorporated at church. At our church, for example, they have farmers that come and in the church parking lot display, their vegetables, and where, you can purchase. And that it may be kind of a nice way to maybe make some changes. At least in the South, it seems to be very good. It's well attended, and maybe working with the church members in terms of supportive community to provide better health in terms of exercise and food.
I think those are great ideas. I think even at churches or within communities or community centers, creating gardens with vegetables that are free for those people that they, come and help with that. We had that when I lived in Chicago. There were certain neighborhoods that created community gardens, and I thought that was wonderful. some neighborhoods, though, that only meant, like in Chicago, that it meant only in the summer we were helping with vegetables. It wasn't, there's a finite period of time that you could grow things. So we need to talk about these things, though, because we really do need to think about how we price food and how we make available, and working with our communities is the first step. I think going to churches is definitely one of the solutions, actually, for us to create that, because also that's a place that you can also talk about why it's important, help them get potentially do screenings and prevention there, because it's a place that's safe to them. And historically, for some communities, hospitals are not always safe places. And recognizing that, I think it's another reason that in medicine too, and we're talking a lot about this now, a little late, but better late than never, is that we need, a diversity in our medical workforce. We need every community represented, because that's the way that we can talk with people that look like us. And the more that we are looking like our greater community, the more trust there is, and the more that we are able to impact at the very beginning where it matters, why we need stability in so many contexts. Of course, here, healthcare, but many other things we can help make better if we're looking like our community.
Well, Martha, this was very, very good. I think we could talk for another hour or two just on healthy lifestyle, but our next podcast should be very interesting, because we'll talk truly about how do we integrate a healthy lifestyle in our treatment and for primary prevention. And we'll talk about aspirin, we'll talk about blood pressure, we'll talk about cholesterol and diabetes. So I think we have a lot to talk about. It's such an enormous field, but it's incredible impact, as we could probably reduce 80% of our cardiovascular disease just by adopting, this kind of prevention.
Yeah.
Martha, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. And we'll talk to you next time.
To learn more from our team of cardiologists, please visit us at MyHeart.net. You can also follow us on social media by searching MyHeart.net on Facebook and Twitter. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss our next episode.